Okay, we are live. Oh, this is exciting. Thank you, everyone. It is a little after 2 here on the West Coast, a little after 5 on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us wherever you are joining from. And for those streaming this live, those watching this later, welcome. And thank you for joining us for our special Saturday Live event entitled Lupus in the News. Is there hope in the headlines? And my name is Kelly. I am the creator and executive director of the Portland based nonprofit More Than Lupus. And if you're unfamiliar with More Than Lupus, we are a multi ethnic, multi generational, and international lupus community designed by lupus patients to connect and to grow and to hopefully inspire each other throughout the peaks, which are the highs, and the valleys, which are the lows of our lupus journeys. And I say are because I have lived with systemic lupus and multiple lupus overlap conditions since the age of 11. Before I go any further, I'd like to bring on my special guest and introduce my special guest and co-host, Dr. Dawn Thomas, board certified rheumatologist and author of the must-have lupus handbook, the Lupus Encyclopedia, which is now in its second edition. He's also our favorite roomie around here. Hello, Dr. Thomas.
Hello, Kelly. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, thank you so much for joining today. Today is going to be more of a conversation that we thought was important to have because of the recent headlines that I know flooded my inbox, and I know you have as well, received calls and texts and emails about these breaking news stories and things in these lupus discoveries. And I mean, I think cause of lupus was trending on Twitter. So it was a lot. And even in my limited understanding of lupus, I mean, I consider myself somewhat of a researcher by proxy, but I am not a medical professional and I am not a lupus expert in any means. When I saw this stuff coming up, Dr. Thomas, I was reading it, and even in my novice perspective, didn't seem like new news to me or anything truly astronomical, but it left me kind of scratching my head and wondering kind of what's going on here, which led me to reach out to you. And you were so kind. And I know you were having some of the same conversations with your colleagues about all this that was flooding the media. And so the idea was born to come together and talk about lupus in the news and what's newsworthy, what is not. Is there actually hope in the headlines?
Sure, Kelly. So these headlines have been all over the internet and social media the past few weeks about a particular study done at Harvard. And I'll just read you one headline, for example. In this online journal called the Epic Times, the title was "Scientists Find a Cause of Lupus and a Way to Potentially Reverse It." Well, this is not just known amongst the lupus community, but I even got an email from my backyard neighbor, Anna, who's a very good friend. And this is what her email says. "Hi, Don. My friend Gail, who has lupus, severe lupus, forwarded the article below about a potential cause and cure for lupus. It always raises my eyebrows when I see things like this. This claim strikes me as another version of a conspiracy theory." Yeah, that's kind of what I thought as well. So anyways, I'd like to explain the study to you and put it into perspective, but also give some advice on how to kind of sort through these kind of things. About a few times a year, we see things pop up in the news about potential cures and the cause of lupus. And so I'd like to talk about them. A lot of times it has us rheumatologists, our eyes roll when we see these a lot of times. So this was a study that was done. It was a study done at both Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard and also Northwestern Medicine by some really renowned scientists, Dr. Calvin Law and Dr. Deepak Rao and their crew. The title of the article, and I think that you, Kelly, have a copy of it to share with your attendees. The title is "Interferon subverts an AHR JUN axis to promote CXCL13 plus T cells in lupus. Yeah, that's a mouthful. And if you read the article, it's even way too complicated for even the average clinician to read. It's incredibly scientific and basic science in perspective. But let me give you some first background about lupus that kind of leads to the study, and then I'll tell you about the results of the study itself. So first off, when we look at people with moderate to severe systemic lupus, about 75 to 80% of them have high levels of a certain cytokine called interferon. Cytokines are the way that white blood cells talk to each other. So, for example, let's say you get a strep throat, or let's say, no, even better, let's say you get a viral infection of the throat. And a way that we fight off viral infections is with a cytokine called interferon. So the immune system starts to release interferon. It calls white blood cells to the throat to attack the virus and keep us nice and safe. But on the downside, lupus patients, a lot of them have persistently high amounts of this interferon, and it causes the DNA inside of white blood cells to make inflammatory cytokines and end up attacking the organs of the person. And this actually led to the discovery of, everybody might have heard of Safnello, or the generic name is anifrolumab, and actually decreases the activity of interferon, therefore decrease inflammation in the body and decrease attacking of the organs. And most people who receive this biologic medication have really good control of their lupus. Yeah. A lot of people do not respond to it. Even though 75 to 80% of patients with systemic lupus have high levels of interferon, 25% don't. 25% have low or normal levels. You know, lupus is different in every single patient. I can line up 100 of my patients, all of them would be different. And we think that lupus is probably a bunch of different diseases that we just are not able to tell the difference with even with modern medicine. But another thing about interferon is that interferon blocks a particular receptor. Well, one way that interferon works by increasing disease activity in lupus is by increasing how DNA makes bad inflammatory cytokines. But another way that it works is that it can block a particular receptor on white blood cells called aryl hydrocarbons receptor. And I'll just call this the lupus bad B cell blocker. Interferon, and what happens when this happens is that then a particular T cells become too overactive. T cells are a type of white blood cell that actually tell B cells to become more active. And the B cells are the ones that make antibodies like anti-double-stranded DNA and things like that. And interferon, it blocks how this receptor works. And so the T cells become too active, and then the B cells become too active. So the question is, if we can interfere with any particular part of this cascade, could we possibly help lupus? And that's the question that the researchers asked. And what they did is that they found this molecule that could actually attach to this receptor and make it active again, resulting in less T cells that caused the B cells to be active. And this is how the study went. They had 19 patients who were on anifrolumab or Safnello. And what they did is they found this molecule that could activate this receptor, and indeed it did make the T cells less active, and then the B cells less active. And then the question is that these researchers had us, could we use this molecule to actually treat lupus? And so the article started to say how there was this cause of lupus and how this could possibly become a cure for lupus. And unfortunately, one of the researchers made the remark, I think this is going to apply to essentially all patients with lupus. And I wish he wouldn't have said that, because as we know, all lupus patients are different. So first off, this was only 19 patients. That's not very many patients. Dr. Jill Bayan, she's a lupus expert at in New York City, and she was asked a question for one of the articles run by, I believe, NBC. And she made the statement, until they study 100 patients prospectively, How are we going to know? And even if such a treatment becomes available, it's unlikely to work for everyone with lupus. One drug does not fit all. And I 100% agree with Dr. Jill Byan in regards to that. They should have never blown this story so out of proportion like they did. So when studies come out like this, and again, this happens a few times a year, how should you approach it and how should you think about it as a lupus patient? Number one, if it sounds too good to be true, like my neighbor Anna, it probably is, like most things in life. Another thing is look at these articles and see if there are other lupus experts that are commenting on the article. Like this one from NBC had Dr. Jill Byan and a few others remark on it, kind of downplaying the role of this article. And so that was a very well-balanced article by NBC News. I was happy to see that. But it was over-exaggerated in too many other articles, which caused the social media frenzy to happen. And then also don't believe in hype, unless you see numerous other lupus experts praising it immediately. Like if a cure comes out, I guarantee you, I'm going to be tweeting about it. I'm going to be putting it on Facebook, and you're going to be seeing this from Dr. Dan Wallace and Dr. Michelle Petrie and other experts, and none of that happened with this particular article. And by the way, there's been lots of other discoveries like this very recently. I went through just a couple of journals in the past 2 months, and I found all of the following. Dr. Li in China, his group discovered something called phosphatidic acid that led to interleukin 17A producing cells being more active. So the question is, could that possibly be a target for helping out lupus patients? Dr. Sharath Gowda in the journal Lupus, she and her team discovered that extracellular mitochondrial markers correlated with lupus nephritis proteinuria. So could we possibly use this new blood test to help us figure out how active lupus nephritis is? Another study showed that by Dr. Hongyu Lang in the journal Lupus showed that high levels of H19, a type of RNA, is high in active lupus. Well, could this possibly be another way to test or possibly even be a target for lupus? That's a possibility. And just multiple other studies just like this. But, the big difference is they don't have a good PR or public relations department. This was Harvard. They have a lot of money. This was also a study that was in conjunction with the National Institutes of Health, and 10 pharmaceutical companies were involved with the research as well. So they had a very good PR mechanism behind it. So that's the first thing I'd like to mention, Kelly, is that's my thoughts about this study. Do you have any questions about it, or what do you think?
I muted my mic because I guess it's causing a little echo sound. So I think it fixed the problem, but I'll be muting my mic on and off. Yeah, so this was something that obviously became a media frenzy. And, you had your neighbor, I had family members and friends and people in the different aspects of the lupus community sending me messages about that particular study. But it just goes to show that there are these staples of people that as we're learning and we're increasing our health literacy, we know these are the people, like you said, yourself, Dan Wallace, Dr. Michelle Petrie, and many others who are really have their finger on the pulse of what is coming and what we should get excited about, and then just to kind of blow the rest away and to just not get too swept up in it.
Yes.
But yeah, Robin said here, she said, what are your thoughts about Northwestern and what they said about this recent study?
Yeah, well, the Northwestern researchers also were very excited about it in the articles that I read, and they should be. And by the way, Robin and everybody watching this this was actually an excellent study. I don't want to downplay it whatsoever. A ton of incredible work went into it. It took quite a few years to finish it. It was very complicated, and the discovery that they made is incredibly important. So, this could possibly lead to a possible treatment. But, the immune system has thousands of different players in it, and multiple studies have been done on multiple potential therapies aimed at all these different parts, and none of them, except for Benlysta and Safnello and Lupkynis, even made it through the clinical trials to show that they truly help it. We need this kind of research in order to start the groundwork for investigating these things further. So this was incredibly important research, but we just have to put it into perspective.
Yes, and it just goes to show that we need better lupus diagnostics, more specific testing. So if some people have those high interferon levels, that's one thing. But if you don't, you'll be testing for other things that could hopefully lead to more precise treatment and better treatment options. Okay, so we've heard about this particular study, but then there's been some other stuff, Dr. Thomas, that you feel didn't get as much attention. However, is very valuable for the lupus patient community and could even be things that we could incorporate into our daily practices, and talking about maybe the krill oil and the omega-3 connections here and all of that. What do you have to share with us regarding those studies?
Sure, Kelly. So I'd like to talk about, like you just mentioned, the question about omega-3 fatty acids. There's more and more research showing and demonstrating that eating an anti-inflammatory diet that is rich in anti-inflammatory containing foods, such as omega-3 fatty acids, appear to benefit people with autoimmune diseases and even cancer, and people at high risk of cardiovascular disease. And the question's always been, does taking a supplement, could this possibly help out? So there's a couple of very interesting studies that recently came out that I think deserve more publicity than the other study that we just heard, because it has some potential practical implications. One of those implications is, can we prevent autoimmune disease in family members of people with lupus? And this is incredibly important. Your family members, lupus is a genetic disorder. There's been identified over 180 genes that cause it. The more genes you inherit, the more likely it is to get the disease. But it takes triggers to turn those genes on, such as ultraviolet light from sunlight, secondhand smoke, smoking cigarettes, eating a poor diet, having a low vitamin D level. And there's more and more research suggesting that avoiding those triggers in family members may actually help decrease the risk of developing diseases like lupus. So this is incredibly important for our lupus community, because it can potentially help your family members. So Dr. Karen Kostenbader, amazing lupologist at Harvard, she's been working on this study now for the past few years, called the VITAL study. The VITAL study is a huge study with over 21,000 adults, over 21,000, and half of them, they gave them a placebo to take. The other half of the patients, they gave them either vitamin D, 2,000 international units to take daily, or 1 gram of omega-3 fatty acids to take. And then they followed them over 2 years, and they asked the question, does it help prevent cancer? Does it help prevent cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes? And does it help to decrease autoimmune disease? Because we know that low vitamin D levels are much more likely in people who are diagnosed with lupus, and vitamin D is essential for white blood cells to work properly, and that's why we prescribe it to our lupus patients to help with disease activity. So this is what they found out. During that 2 years, 514 of the participants developed an autoimmune disease. And what they showed, those patients who were taking 2,000 international units of vitamin D a day had a 15% reduced rate of developing an autoimmune disease. And except for one, except especially for one, there was the psoriasis. There was actually a 40% reduction in the onset of psoriasis. We don't know the numbers for lupus, by the way, because the numbers were way too low. Psoriasis is a lot more common than lupus, and that's how they were able to figure out the statistics for psoriasis. But that was fascinating. Taking vitamin D is a very safe thing to do. Family members can take it. Their doctors can monitor their levels to make sure they don't go too high. So that if I had a family member, I would certainly be recommending that to them. But the other part was omega-3 fatty acids. They took 1 gram a day of omega-3 fatty acids and showed that there was a 13% reduction in autoimmune diseases. That doesn't sound so amazing, does it? But when they looked at those who had family members who had autoimmune diseases, there was a 30% reduction in autoimmune disease. So the people with family history were benefited the greatest by taking an omega-3 fatty acid. So that's something that your family members may want to consider taking. I will have to mention, before I get done, I'll talk about potential side effects and such, but there's a particular website I like to use called consumerlab.com. If you ever want to find out if a particular supplement brand is safe and effective and has in it what it's supposed to have in it, consumerlab.com actually evaluates over-the-counter supplements to make sure they actually have in them what they state that they have on them, since there's no FDA regulation. But they recommend that people not take over 2 grams a day of omega-3 fatty acids to prevent the possibility of side effects. It's just something your family members may want to consider. Well, there's a separate study came out within a month of this one by Dr. Kostenbader. This one was done by it was a multi-center study headed by Dr. Jane Salmon. She's at the Hospital of Special Surgery in New York City. Dr. Daniel Wallace at Cedars-Sinai in California, one of the world's best lupologists. Dr. Peter Lipsky, who's an incredible lupus expert. Now he has a company called Ample Bio, which has made a new laboratory test to help out lupus patients. But they asked the question, does high-dose krill oil benefit lupus? The reason that they asked this is that there's some theoretical possibilities that krill oil may be better than other types of omega-3 fatty acid sources because it's made in a particular way that's more easy to digest and get incorporated into the body. So what they did is that they had 30 patients in their study that received 4 grams a day of krill oil, which is a high dose, and they had 34 lupus patients take a placebo group. And then they treated all the patients the same way they would normally treat them for their lupus, and they followed them over 6 months. Now, at the very beginning, they tested their blood levels for omega-3 fatty acid levels. They can actually measure that, and 38% had low levels. This is important because it has been shown that people with low levels of omega-3 fatty acids have a higher risk of heart attacks and strokes. The #1 cause of death in lupus patients, and they happen 10 to 20 years earlier than they should. Why were they so low? Because they ate the standard American diet. The standard American diet, the initials are SAD. It's the SAD diet. And so they were eating that diet that certainly increases the risk of heart attacks and strokes, but also autoimmune diseases like lupus. So what they did is they then measured their omega-3 fatty acid levels over the study. By 4 weeks, almost everyone had normal omega-3 fatty acid levels in their blood. So one question is, could those patients who started off with bad levels, could this actually reduce their risk of heart attacks and strokes? It's a possibility. What they also showed is that in those lupus patients who started off with high disease activity, looking at a research tool called the SLEDAI, which stands for Systemic Lupus Erythematosus Disease Activity Index, their scores were greater than 9. Those who started off with high disease activity, when they compared the ones who took krill oil to those who took a placebo, they had better improvements in their disease activity at the 4th, the 8th, and the 16th week. Now, at the 24th week, there was not much of a difference between the groups, but at those 3 other points in time, there was significant improvements in their disease activity. How about side effects? We know that omega-3 fatty acids and krill can cause stomach upset and diarrhea, bloating, belching, and things like this. Well, guess what? There were more side effects in the placebo group. Now, how does that happen? Well, whenever someone's in a study, every time they come in, they give them a long list of questions and they say, have you had nausea? Have you had stomach upset? Have you had diarrhea? Have you had headaches? Have you had fevers? And then they compare the placebo group and the medication group. And then if there's a whole lot more in the medication group, that's what the FDA lists on the package insert. But there were less in the krill group. That does not mean that placebo causes more side effects than krill oil does. The bottom line is that this was a very small study, only 30 patients. Just think about that. The Benlysta studies, there were thousands of patients in those studies. So we can't really say that krill oil causes less side effects, but we can say that it must not cause very much side effects with the doses that they took. Otherwise, we would have seen a lot more than we did. So there was a primary outcome. The primary outcome for this study was to see if it increased the blood levels, which it did. The secondary outcome was decrease in disease activity. A big problem with this study, though, Kelly, is that it took place during COVID-19. So as you can imagine, there was a large dropout rate in the number of patients. Actually, 23% of the patients dropped out during the study, which unfortunately led to more difficulty in reaching statistical significance on the results. So that was a downside of the study. But we do have some unanswered questions from the study. It is a small study, so the question is, if there was a larger study that went in for a longer amount of time, could it possibly show decreased disease activity in those who took krill oil over the long run? Is there any difference in side effects between the groups? And could there possibly be less less heart attacks and strokes in those who took krill oil? We don't know, and I hope that someone does that study, because this was a very impressive initial study, and the researchers and their conclusions recommended that this type of study that is larger and goes on for longer should be done. And so as a lupus patient, you might want to consider taking krill oil because, number one, it does appear to be safe, and it might possibly have some effectiveness as well. But I do need to point out that there are potential side effects with omega-3 fatty acids. Number one are the gastrointestinal side effects. So if you do decide to take it, start off at a small dose, go up on the dose slowly, and don't exceed what's on the bottle. These particular participants took high doses, but I would not recommend that without asking your doctor about it first. Some other potential side effects is that it can cause thinning of the blood. So if you're on blood thinners, it can make the blood even thinner. You do want to make sure you stop it before surgeries, because you don't want to bleed around the time of surgeries. However, they did do a study with high doses of omega-3 fatty acids, the prescription type, and actually showed no increased bleeding. But theoretically, I would still ask my patients to stop it. The omega-3 fatty acids can potentially reduce blood pressure. So if you already have low blood pressure, make sure to watch that closely. Then the question is, if you're allergic to fish, what do you do? Well, I'll tell you that I get anaphylaxis when I eat crustacean, but I take glucosamine sulfate and chondroitin sulfate, which are actually made out of crustacean, and I get no side effects at all. So if you have a high quality product, that should not happen. They did do a study with 6 fish allergic patients, gave them omega-3 fatty acids from fish oil, and none of them had a problem with it. In the medical literature, there is one case report of someone having a bad side effect to omega-3 fatty acids who had a fish allergy, but that's pretty low out of the millions of doses that are probably taken worldwide. Another very important thing is that omega-3 fatty acids could possibly increase the risk of atrial fibrillation. We don't know for sure, but there was one study that showed that that people who took omega-3 fatty acids, they had a 5.3% prevalence of developing atrial fibrillations compared to 4.1% of people who took a placebo. So there is that question, and because of that, we would not recommend that people with pre-existing heart disease take omega-3 fatty acids. Also, people should not take high doses of omega-3 fatty acids unless you have your heart rhythm monitored closely. And then there's always the potential for drug interactions. Please remember that supplements, if they work for a disease, they're always going to potentially have side effects. There's absolutely no way you can have both. And, you know, unless we can find incredibly safe cures in the future. Right now, modern medicine is not that advanced. And it's the same thing with this. Even over-the-counter omega-3 fatty acids, they can potentially increase the risk of drug levels of tacrolimus, cyclosporin, and sirolimus, which are used in lupus patients. And then one last thing is you can't take cod liver oil or other fish liver oils and think you're getting the omega-3 fatty acids supplements like you do from other ones, because these are high in vitamin A and vitamin D, and you can take too much of those. So I would not substitute those. And the bottom line is, please don't take my word and start taking this supplement unless you talk to your doctor. Everybody's clinical situation is different. You know, it might have some interactions with your particular medicines. So ask your doctor first if it's safe for you to take and whether they recommend that you take it. But this is really a fascinating thing, because family members could potentially help decrease their risk of developing autoimmune diseases. And could we possibly decrease disease activity with something so safe as krill oil? It's a possibility, and it's exciting.
I'm pressing all the buttons right now. Oops. Yeah, I found it really fascinating. And just everyone, so that you're aware, at the beginning of the comments, there's a disclaimer that states that Dr. Thomas is not liable for his comments because he's not acting as your personal physician. So make sure you read that at the top of the comments. I have seen a couple other studies that through, I think it was Bristol Myers Squibb and through Lupus Therapeutics regarding krill oil. And I had all these questions locked and loaded for you, and then you answered them all about the allergy situation, because both you and I share a shellfish allergy. Mine is iodine and shellfish. What's interesting, Dr. T, and I've been meaning to ask you this, in our group of our Portland lupus community and other groups where I find myself in community with a lot of people who have lupus, we all, 9 out of 10 usually, have a shellfish allergy, have an allergy to iodine. And I have no idea if you've seen that in your lupus populations, this kind of prevalence of that. Because we talked about the krill and, you know, going, oh, don't know about that because of our allergies.
Sure. So Kelly, that's probably anecdotal. I'll just have to say that in my patient population, in my lupus center, I really haven't seen that, but I also have not formally studied it. I haven't seen any research studies to show it. However, I would not be surprised, because there's absolutely studies that show that that many lupus patients have multiple allergies, especially to medications, and lupus patients overall as a group are more prone to drug allergies than other people, especially antibiotics. So it wouldn't surprise me, but I have not seen that myself, and I haven't seen it studied, but I would not be surprised.
Yeah, very interesting. So then you talked about maybe an alternative. And I know a lot of these studies, they are specifically showing kind of higher dose levels of omega-3 supplements. So I know many of the people watching right now and streaming this later, they're going to want to know, how much am I supposed to take? And that's something that you need to talk to your physician about and figure out what level is going to be best for you. And as Dr. T states, check out consumerlab.com to make sure that the supplements that you are getting are quality controlled and are not, because a lot of times you think you're buying something over the counter and it really isn't the best quality, doesn't have what it says it has, and it's just a waste of money.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say about consumerlab.com, and then by the way, I'm not associated with them at all. I, don't have any financial interest, but I find them to be very interesting. They actually they list the studies that show whether something's effective or not for certain diseases and also side effects. So they're incredibly thorough. So I really like them as a nice resource, not just to see if a supplement has been studied and whether it's a good brand or not, but they actually go over the research studies themselves. So it's a very good company.
And you also suggested, as lupus patients, how we can know when something is being kind of put out there as either media hype or if it's not coming from a reliable source. What, in your opinion, what sources, websites, research programs, etc., would you say should be our places to go? Some of us really appreciate the data and we want to be informed as patients. And it can get frustrating to see stuff that's really hyped out there and trending. And we want to trust and we want to have hope in these things, but we also want to use discernment and know, okay, maybe that study, what can we look for essentially if they're posting a study? What are the kind of the buzzwords where we know, okay, this is a double blind or this isn't a double blind, this is peer reviewed, this is not peer reviewed. Can you just go over a little bit of that so we can put on our filter and know how to vet some of the stuff that's out there?
Sure. So as far as the hyped up media information, the things that I mentioned earlier are the best things to go by. When looking at a study itself, number one, making sure it's in a major journal, such as the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, Arthritis and Rheumatology, which is our major journal, the journal Lupus. There's a lot of the ones with big names like that that are reliable. And in all of those, they are peer reviewed very, very thoroughly, and they're not going to publish them unless they were very well done. And they're not going to overhype them. At the end of every single research study, they always list what their limitations are and what still needs to be done. And by the way, the authors in the study did do that. It's just that the media, they grabbed a hold of the hyped up parts of things. But also going to certain websites like Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, those are good ones to look at, except the Cleveland Clinic did have a media article kind of overhyping this one, so we can't always even trust those at all. And also, even just to point something out, even those big names like Johns Hopkins, they sometimes make mistakes. Like you can go to the website and they have an article saying that garlic, you should avoid garlic if you have lupus because it could potentially make lupus active. That is old. I mean, that's a couple of decades old and it's incorrect. But the lupus experts at Johns Hopkins, they're way too busy to keep scouring their websites to see what kind of things they should ask the webmaster to take out. Because once they're in there, they're permanently in there. So you do got to be careful. Try to find something that's up to date. Look at the date, see if it says 2024, 2023. That's an important one. And then, of course, ask the experts. If you go to my website, lupusencyclopedia.com, on all of my blog posts, you can actually comment, and I actually answer all the comments and questions that I get on there. So there's a lot of different ways to tell.
I'm putting all these in the notes in the comment box so people can see and follow along. And just, yeah, Dr. Thomas, lupusencyclopedia.com. You're so wonderful responding to people. It's so helpful. I know that I've just truly been so thankful to have you as a resource to be able to say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? It's really, really a great resource. I hope my mic is okay. I'm going to just kind of highlight some people that are on with us, see if there's any questions for the last few minutes of this live. We have people joining all the way from Seoul, Korea here today, wow, which is wonderful. We've got Emily and Julieta and Lynn and Robin, people from both coasts here. Yep, here is Min Sung. So good to see you there. Let's see. Robin, I wonder if you can answer this. I did a study per se and have found that out of 100 ladies, 81 of us have had hysterectomies. Is there a correlation?
Yeah, that's interesting. We know that in women with lupus, there is an increased risk of endometriosis, for example. So, that's probably one of the reasons for some of those hysterectomies. As far as uh, lipomas or myofibromas in the uterus, I don't know if those are increased or not, but I haven't seen a study about that, but I would not be surprised because especially the endometriosis problem is a big problem.
Let's see. And then lots of people saying we love some Dr. T and all he does for us. Thank you. We have Emily here, and she said, I have a borderline lupus diagnosis from a high anti-dsDNA test, but then the advised test just showed positive SSA and SSB. So now I'm diagnosed with Sjogren's. But doc thinks I'm still developing a lupus-related issue based on my symptoms. My question is it possible to prevent that from fully developing?
Yeah, that's a good question. First off, with anti-double-stranded DNA, which this person mentions, there are several different ways to measure it, and people can absolutely be positive for one test and not the other because double-stranded DNA is an incredibly large, complicated molecule, and so we can make antibodies to different parts of it, and they can be picked up by different tests. For example, the AVISE test from Exogen, they check for something called the Crithidia test, which may be very different than what you get from your local doctor, which might be a test called the ELISA test or one called the FAR test. So it's not unusual for that to happen. But to be positive for that and anti-SSA and anti-SSB and anti-nuclear antibody, it'd be very unusual not to have a systemic autoimmune diseases. And it sounds like your doctors felt like you were consistent with Sjogren's disease, where the immune system attacks the glands of the body. And for everybody else watching this, a large percentage of lupus patients do get Sjogren's disease. So if you have dry mouth or dry eyes, most people don't think about it or bring it up to their doctors. But please do, because you could have Sjogren's disease along with your lupus. It's not uncommon to have more than one autoimmune disease. For people to develop one autoimmune disease, then have other ones add on over time. There has been a couple of studies that showed that taking hydroxychloroquine regularly was the primary thing that decreased the risk of having polyautoimmunity or more than one autoimmune disease. And then if I was an autoimmune disease patient, I would be incredibly strict about avoiding all the triggers like wearing sunscreen religiously, not smoking, not being around other smokers, taking a vitamin D supplement if I was low. And I list all of these triggers to avoid in my lupus secrets. But that's the other thing that could potentially help.
That was really interesting. And are you still? Do you find that the level of ANA titer is also indicative of either disease activity or a diagnosis, or is it just more of a combination of factors that they do have it doesn't really matter how high the ANA titer is, if they're positive for other autoantibodies?
Sure, that's a great question. Absolutely, the higher the anti-nuclear antibody level, and by the way, most of us probably have positive anti-nuclear antibodies. They add the person's serum on top of a slide, and then they add some immunofluorescence that binds to antibodies that bind to the nucleus. And then what they do is they add some serum in an equal amount. That's called a 1-to-1 mix. They do it again. It's called a 1-to-2 mix. They do it again. It's a 1-to-4 mix. And it's not until they get above 1-to-40 that they start to count the positives. So most of us probably have, lower amounts of anti-nuclear antibodies, and they just arbitrarily make that particular cutoff. And certainly the people who have 1 to 640 and higher, especially 1 to 1280 and higher, they have a significantly higher rate of having some sort of autoimmune disease if they have symptoms consistent with it compared to lower ones. So there is that correlation. Now, as far as disease activity, anti-nuclear antibody does not seem to fluctuate with disease activity. You could have a very low level and still have very, very severe disease. But because of that, we used to say that people should not have their ANA repeated over time. It's a waste of blood and it's a waste of money. But there was another study in the past few years that showed that lupus patients in whom their ANA becomes negative, they're at lower risk of flares from their lupus. And so now we know that it is a prognostic sign that if your ANA becomes negative, that's good for you because your risk of flaring is less compared to if your ANA is persistently positive. So it does have some help in that respect.
That is so interesting. Yeah, because I remember once it's tested, it's positive, you need not test it again. But that's really fascinating to hear those updates. We have people thanking you again for your knowledge and explaining what the recent studies were about. Oh, and that they love your gorgeous cat.
Thank you. This is Sarah Way. He helps me out.
Your kitty is funny and his spots are amazing. Here's another comment from Emily. Thank you. Yes, I was wondering if avoiding the sun was still necessary, even if I don't have a reaction, apart from fatigue.
Yes, I'm glad this person asked that question, and particularly that person with the anti-SSA. Anti-SSA absolutely increases ultraviolet light sensitivity, and it's one of the bad things we see from anti-SSA. But there was a study done in the early 2000s by Dr. Victoria Worth. She's an amazing lupus skin expert up in Pennsylvania, and she demonstrated in her patients that 96% of systemic lupus patients were sensitive to ultraviolet light exposure. And that's just the ones that they could actually prove in that particular test. So we have to assume that every lupus patient is sensitive to ultraviolet light. And this is why. I mean, I'm sensitive to ultraviolet light. That's how we get wrinkles. You sit even underneath incandescent and fluorescent lights. They're even though it's a very low amount of light, UV light compared to the sun outside, they go through the skin and then they actually damage the skin cells. And it's this damage to the skin cells that ends up causing wrinkling over time. I get skin cancer. I'm wearing sunscreen right now, Kelly, even though I'm not outside and I haven't gone outside today because my family gets a lot of skin cancer and I've already had one and I want to protect myself from this indoor lighting right here. But in lupus, it's a lot worse. The cells of your skin, they release those nuclear contents, and all at once those nuclear antigens like DNA, SSA antigens, SSB antigens, they go into your blood and lymphatic system. And then what happens? Your lupus autoantibodies, like anti-double-stranded DNA, sees that DNA, thinks it's a foreign invader, binds to it, makes something called an immune complex, floats through the blood, goes to organs like the kidneys where it lodges, and can cause inflammation and even lupus nephritis by doing that. So even though only about 30% of our lupus patients get a rash at the area of sun exposure or ultraviolet light exposure, we have to assume every single lupus patient is ultraviolet light sensitive. Every lupus patient should be using sunscreen religiously every day, even if they don't go outside, and abide by other important measures like having LED bulbs in the house instead of fluorescent or incandescent light bulbs. It has just a tiny amount of UV light, much less than the other two types of bulbs. You should have a wide-brimmed hat. You should not be going out the door without a wide-brimmed hat on. There's some very fashionable ones these days. Make sure to wear SPF high clothing all the time as well. There's a lot of tips and tricks with UV exposure. Think of sunscreen as one of your important medications.
There you have it, folks. That was an explosion of pearls of wisdom right there at the end here. And I hope you were taking notes, just to reiterate what Dr. T said, only 30%, around 30% of people with photosensitivity actually get rashes. I know I had a little too much UV exposure yesterday. My vision's blurry today. I'm tired. You know, it affects all of us a little bit differently, but you will see it. And sometimes it's not immediate, it's accumulative, and then all of a sudden it'll hit you. But you don't want to get yourself in a tricky situation where it's going to impact you and your health dramatically. And it's so, so good to be proactive, not reactive, by wearing that sunscreen. Apply every 90 minutes, more if you're in water, a shot glass full, and a nice SPF of 70 and above of the good quality stuff will get you going there. Well, thank you so much, Dr. T. We've got more people saying that they're so thankful. Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you for organizing this. And as we're just kind of wrapping up, someone's asking about the dermatologist's name who was from Pennsylvania, that you said you would like to do further research on lupus and the sun. Would you repeat the dermatologist's
Yes,
name?
Lynn, that's Dr. Victoria Worth. Her name is spelled W-E-R-T-H, and she's one of the world's experts in lupus skin disease.
Fantastic. Oh, there is just one last question here. I got HCQ retinopathy 19 years ago, had to stop taking it. I wish I could go back thinking of all the benefits. Thank you so much, Dr. T. Let's see, and lots of thank yous coming in. So just wanted to say once again, thank you so much for your time today on a Saturday. I know you're busy with life and with your work, and we want to make sure that if you haven't done so already, to check out the lupusencyclopedia.com. And also, if you haven't done so already, get yourself a copy of the second edition of the Lupus Encyclopedia. If you already have one, go on Amazon and write a review. Get this reviewed. It helps with getting him more exposure and kicking off some other books that don't need to be there at the top of the, of the lupus books.
Thank you, Kelly. And my every chapter has a lupus expert who helped out, and they appreciate that too.
It's wonderful. And as you can see, it's already getting well loved over here. Oh, yeah, people are saying they're going to do that today. They're going to write a review today. So thank you again, Dr. T, for your time. This is going to be downloaded to YouTube, so we can share this with people who do not have Facebook. And just to get the word, just trying to dispel stuff and just really bringing the information to everybody out there is our goal here. So thank you again, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you, Kelly. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.